Thank you for joining us in person and on Zoom. We're thrilled to have James Bennet here for a really interesting presentation that is very relevant to all of us. I also wanted to bring attention to the fact that it is National Library Week this week. So it's a great time to engage with library programs as you're all doing and to celebrate the different aspects of the library that we have to offer. So today is actually History Day. Ken here had his history session at noon, so that's great. And tomorrow is Young Readers Day. And it's also a great time to support the library and help us continue to have great programs and services. It's easy to donate online, or there's dip jars by the circulation desk. So we appreciate any support that you give. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome James Bennet. He has had a distinguished career as a practicing naval architect and marine technology and product developer. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan and holds a B.S.E in naval architecture and marine engineering and an M.S.E degree in Ship Hydrodynamics. I don't know what that is, but it sounds impressive. In 2017, Jim was elected to the National Academy of Sciences and served on the Marine Board, where he was the principal advisor on autonomous marine vehicle development. So I know that you have a lot to say about this topic, and I can't wait to learn. So yeah, welcome.
Shall we go?
So much.
All right, thank you. Pleasure to be here. And you might ask, what does all that have to do with the subject today? But we are talking about the movement of water, so there's at least that connection. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm also glad to see a number of faces that I recognize here in the crowd tonight. The relevance of the topic was brought home to us all here a couple of months ago with this corker of a storm that we had that hit Camden Harbor, and I'm going to be talking a bit about the historic nature of that storm, but also the less than historic nature of that storm, because my bottom line here is that we were very lucky in Camden that we escaped with as little damage as we had, and I'll explain why. But nonetheless, that was an eye-opening and attention-grabbing event. And my subject tonight is about the future of these events and how they're going to affect Camden Harbor and things that we might be able to do to reduce the damage and the risk that we've been carrying. So why do I say that that storm could have been a lot worse? Well, the major reason was that our peak tide occurred well in advance of the passage of the low pressure center of that storm, which went just to the north of us and passed out to sea. But the low pressure center didn't pass until almost 6 hours after the high tide. And if it had come directly at the high tide, the storm surge would have been much worse. I'll tell you more about the surge that we experienced, but we were fortunate. The other thing is the wind, the peak winds were below hurricane force, but we did have sustained winds on the Lyman Morris dock house. The wind vane or the wind instrument on the top of the dock house at Lyman Morris recorded a speed of 65 knots before it blew off, and the dock house itself was displaced, actually dislodged from its foundations. But other wind instruments in the area, there's a company called Davis that makes wind instruments, and there's a number of their stations that are around in this area, and one of them at Owl's Head, and another one on Dillingham Point, and so forth. And so looking at those records, you can get a pretty good idea of how much wind we saw here. But there was actually a higher wind, sustained wind and gust up here in Camden Harbor than there was at the mouth of Penobscot Bay. And for those of us that sail or spend time on the water out here, we understand that phenomena. And it has to do with the Camden Hills. And when winds come up from the south, the way this storm approached, they hit those hills and they accelerate as the wind has to get over the top when it's coming from the south. And so it actually gets accelerated by those hills. So we saw 55 knots out at the mouth of Penobscot Bay, and up here in the Camden Harbor, we saw 65.
Just gonna click off this thing that appeared here.
Good.
Get rid of that.
That looks better. I don't think I did that. All I have to do is get close.
No, it was somebody on Zoom.
Okay. Also the duration of the storm was relatively brief compared to some of the other major storms that we've had here. In fact, one of the storms, the most significant one we had in 1978, was actually stayed in this area for a total of 3 days, and we had 6 tide cycles during the period of that storm. So all of those things made this storm in December actually not as severe as it could have been. So here is a weather map for those of you that like to read such things, but it shows the low pressure system just over upper New York State as it was approaching the coastline early on the 23rd of December. And the pressure was measured at 982 millibars, which is significant, but it's nowhere near historic lows. And the expected wind direction, with that center being slightly to the north of Camden, was to pull wind in from the southeast. And that's what we saw. You know, this was not a nor'easter. This was a southerly blow. And that happens to be where we get most of our most severe weather. The northeasters tend to get blocked by the islands to the east of us and also to the north. And so when we get storm surge, the worst case for Camden is the direction from the southeast. This was the 1978 storm. You're not going to be able to read all these isobars on this chart, but it showed a 976 millibar low, which again is lower than the storm we experienced in December. And the meteorological predicted tide in 78 was 12 feet above mean low water. And the tide prediction for Camden was 12.4 feet, but the actual measured tide, and I have to say it's approximate in Camden because we don't actually have a tide gauge. So I've been working out how to approximate these tides, looking at the actual measurements at Portland and Bar Harbor, which are the 2 nearest tide stations. But our tide, this is again calm water level, was about 14.2 feet, 14 feet 3 inches approximately. And in 1978, we saw a storm surge of 15 feet, and that was recorded by the Geologic Survey and NOAA, who both did post-mortem analyses of the storm. And then the wave peak on top of that, that's a calm water tide level. We saw about 16 feet of wave action. That would be the peak of the waves. And that's a half amplitude above the calm water level. And in 78, we saw 17.5 feet. And that's been, again, recorded by the Coast and Geodetic Survey back then. So, yeah, it could have been worse. If you take what was reported as damage, and this comes out of the Camden Herald, to the harbor at that time, it added up, if you escalate it to current year dollars, somewhere in the neighborhood of $750,000 of damage. And that was to structures. Does not include damage to boats. There were no boats, or very few, in the harbor at the time of that storm in 78. And likewise, this time around in December, there were very few boats in the harbor, although the ones that were there, the big schooners, were very valuable. It was a good thing we didn't lose them. But compared to the storm damage from December, we only saw, well, we've recorded or reported $300,000 in damage, and that was to municipal property alone. So that does not include private property. So it was an expensive event. But like I say, it was not as bad as it could have been. So here's a look at Camden, bird's eye view, and the direction that we are most exposed in terms of storm surge and wind is southeast. And that's because there's nothing to the southeast until you get all the way past Bermuda. We're quite exposed in that direction. And as you can see in this chart, if wind is coming from the east and the northeast, we at least have the islands to break up the wave action. And so even though northeasters can be very troublesome, and they can knock down a lot of telephone wires and on trees and such, but in terms of storm surge, southeast is our worst direction. So how often do we get southeast winds? Well, it turns out that most of the time we see southeast winds in June. The bottom of this chart shows the months of the year, and the vertical axis is the percentage of time that wind is blowing from those directions. And that's for this locale here, Camden. And this data does come from the National Weather Service. And so even though you see in January, for instance, only a 5% chance of a southeast wind, and in December, not much more than that. What happens when we get southerly winds in those times of the year is they're very severe. They when the wind backs around into those directions, it comes in almost like a hurricane, which is nearly what we saw. We had essentially was a Category 1 storm. And so if it's June, July, fortunately, when we have most of our boats in the water and where the waterfront is most often occupied, those months are relatively low risk in terms of seeing the kind of storm that we just had. But then the frequency of the winds, we see a lot more southerly breezes in that time of the year, and they tend to be much more benign than the storm that we saw. So here's actual recorded data, and this is coming from mid-Maine shelf, because the buoys that are closer, there's only one buoy closer to Camden, which is the Penn Bay mid-channel buoy, was not recording during the storm. It was basically offline, so that had to do with its history of being rather unreliable. But what this shows along the bottom is, I should have brought a pointer here, but the scale along the bottom is hours in the day. And what this shows actually is that this was approximately here 10:40 a.m. when we had our high tide. And the reason these numbers here are offset, this is military time, but this is recorded in universal time constant. So whether that's the time in Greenwich, England. Our time here when that high tide occurred was 10:40. And what you see here is the wind speed. And we were seeing, this is sustained wind. I'm sorry, this is a gust speed. Yeah, this is wind gust, but of 42 knots. But as I said, later on at this same buoy during the day, as the tide was going out, we actually saw higher winds. And as I said earlier, those winds were accelerated up into Penobscot Bay. And again, this is the wind direction. So you can see it started east and moved to the southeast and then veered around into the southwest and west, almost all the way west, as the storm passed to the north of us. So at the height of the tide, the wind was in the worst direction, southeast, 135 degrees, almost exactly. And that caused a lot of problems for us in the harbor because the wave action was exacerbated by that wind direction. And so was the storm surge, the actual rise of water. And this is a look at the barometer. And so you can see that at the time that our high tide occurred, that barometer was reading 998, which is still a low barometer, but nowhere near as low as it got. And we saw actually the worst or the minimum pressure occurring at about 5:20 p.m., which is roughly exactly at low tide. So when we saw that pressure drop, which creates the maximum storm surge, that was at low tide. So again, we lucked out. And this is just a graph showing the storm surge in relationship to the predicted water levels. And so Portland saw a surge of about 2.4 feet. Bar Harbor saw a surge of 1.5. And I estimate that our surge in Camden was a little bit more than 2 feet. So it's, if the rule of thumb here is that we're about 2/3 of the way between Portland and Bar Harbor. And being relatively close to the ocean, our tides are going to be roughly 2/3 of the difference between those 2 points. So we did get a considerable storm surge, but again, we were lucky that it didn't occur at the worst point, which would have been at the low tide. What I should say would have been at the high tide, but occurred at 6 hours later at low tide. All right, so a little bit more about our risk here in Camden. So the NOAA is the source of tidal measurements and storm surge and flooding, and they have this handy graph, which is the individual bars on this graph show height of water and average number of flood events per year in different areas around the United States. So there's somewhere like 32 locations on this chart. But the length of these bars indicates the frequency of flooding. And we see that Bar Harbor has a frequency that's ranks second in the nation right now, next to Virginia. And the Portland is ranking number 4. So we're seeing quite a bit of quite a high frequency of flooding. But what's even more significant in this chart is the trend in the data. So this shows you those long blue lines are the period of 2010 to 2020. So that's the most recent data. And the dark blue, red and green, those are decades earlier. And what we're seeing is a significant increase in the frequency of flooding. Now, it's natural to ask, why is that happening? Well, part of it is sea levels, which are changing. They've been recorded and been increasing ever since the records have been taken. And we're seeing an increased rate of sea level rise. It's still not very shocking. We're talking about 3.5 millimeters a year, maybe going up to 5 millimeters a year over the next 10 years. But millimeters take a while to accumulate. So there's other things that are going on here. And one of them is intensity and severity of storms. There's definitely an increase in the frequency of hurricanes. And the tracks of those hurricanes are beginning to go further north. But the other thing is we're seeing more frequent winter storms. And while the intensity is not necessarily increasing in those storms, we're just seeing a lot more of them. And that gives the probability of a storm occurring at a nominal high tide during the day, that probability increases. So that's part of what we're seeing here. And the other thing, which I don't have data on, but I speculate, is that because of the overall warming in the oceans, but in particular the Gulf of Maine, is that the volume of the water is increasing. And so as the volume increases and also the mass increases, you've got a change in the dynamics of the system. And I'll leave that to a further future debate or discussion. But nonetheless, the trend is pretty clear. We're getting a lot more frequent flooding. And this shows that the number of storms and the severity of storms, what we're seeing here is a record of storms that have caused surges in Camden Harbor over the last roughly 90 years. And what we've seen in the last 4 years are 6 storms that have caused flood levels to exceed 12.5 feet. 12.5 is roughly, that captures the highest 10% of storm surges. That is the tides above 12.5 feet. 16 storms in 86 years, 6 storms in 4 years. So what we've been experiencing here recently is a significant increase in the frequency of the storms. And these are severe storms. You can see that the tidal surges associated with these storms have been significant. And this is what a 100-year storm event will look like if we see a 100-year storm. The question is, what is a 100-year storm? And so the period from that 1978 storm to the one we just had was only about 44 years. So we have not seen a 100-year recurrence of that 78 storm. But this whole issue of recurrence events, recurrence intervals, is one that can get quite puzzling, because what does it mean? When somebody says a 100-year storm, does that mean you're not going to see one for another 100 years? No, what it means is that there's a certain probability that increases over time that will reach roughly 99% in 100 years. But between any point in time and that future event, 100 years out, that probability increases. It starts off fairly low, but it increases exponentially. And I'll show you what that curve looks like. But so we had 17, we had a 16-foot storm surge in the December storm. These flood elevations predicted by the Army Corps are showing a 17-foot storm surge based on a 100-year event. And the outer harbor is expected to see a 21-foot event or storm surge in a 100-year event. So you can see there's quite a bit more area involved in that. But nonetheless, we're talking about a storm surge that could occur of 5 feet more than what we just experienced. And that would be a startling event. But there is a probability of this occurring, and we don't know when it's going to occur, but we do know that it is possible. And we've seen communities not too far from here that have experienced these storm surges. In particular, Cape Cod has seen storm surges of this magnitude and even more. But as the storms move further east and north, then our risk is going to be increasing. So this is an attempt to kind of depict that. And you can see, I used as a reference here the seawall at the Camden Yacht Club, which I've become intimately familiar with. More on that later. But the top of that seawall is roughly 14 feet 9. The town dock has a benchmark at 13.6, which has now been altered. We've just raised the town dock, I think, a little bit more than a foot. But at any rate, that was the level of the town dock when I made this chart a couple months ago. But you can see that the 16-foot surge that we had on the 22nd, was it overtopped seawall at the yacht club. And some of the more spectacular images or videos that you can see on YouTube, and thanks to Allison McKellar for getting some of that compiled and out there. There was a considerable storm surge and a wave action that overtopped our seawall at the Camden Yacht Club. And it also affected, as I mentioned earlier, Lyman Morse and all of the other properties all the way down to the library park that were affected by this 16-foot storm surge. So you can imagine if we get 5 feet more than that, what's going to happen to our downtown Camden. I'm not saying that, the certainty of that occurring is a variable. And as time goes on, it's going to become more certain. And I'm not saying that is going to occur in any given period of time here, but the probability is what this curve in the upper left shows, that by 2050, we have roughly a 30% chance of that event occurring. That's an approximation. And that's based purely on the statistical extrapolation of a 100-year event. And it does not include any of the climatology. I've got some charts that do include that. What is happening to the climate that's going to affect that probability? And that is the big question. How much do we know? How much do we think we know? And what is actually going to happen are all three separate things. So this is an attempt to extrapolate using the best science that we have available, where an event that we just saw, how long it might be before we see another one. And this is based on some very sophisticated climatology and modeling that's being done by Professor Carrie Emanuel, whose brother Woody is sitting here this evening. And these predictions that Carrie is putting together are using forecasts of the warming of the ocean, which has the significant influence on frequency of storms. And he's also using storm tracks. He's got a computer that can generate synthetic storm tracks. And they're based on actual storm events. But then the synthetic part is to see how those tracks would be affected by changes in climate, and particularly in ocean temperatures. And those projections are what Carrie does professionally, and he's world renowned for it. And what this chart shows is that the blue point on this chart, which was the December storm that we just had, under nominal conditions that persisted up until roughly, let me get the dates right here, up through 2010, that we could have expected a storm like that to occur every 48 years. That's what this blue chart shows. Well, it happened to be 44 years that we had a repeat. That 78 storm occurred after, before our December storm. So if you're following me at all, as I'm fumbling through this, but what this is saying is that under the nominal conditions that prevailed before 2010, we wouldn't have seen a storm like that every 45 to 48 years. But what we can expect in the future is that could occur more frequently. And what Carrie is showing here is that his best models and analysis, again, based on, it's really a number of different scenarios of possible increase in water temperatures and air temperatures, that interval has been reduced to about 17 years. And that means we can expect to see more frequent storms, even if the precision of this chart may not be exact, but the trend that's shown here is very definite and can be verified by even the measurements that we've been able to do since these kinds of models and analyses have been available to us. It takes an enormous amount of computer power to do this. So what's the impact? Well, we can expect to see recurring property damage. And what's causing that damage is wave impact, the high velocity flow of water, which causes erosion, scours out beneath the foundations and the supporting structures. There is a direct economic impact when we have downtime to repair the structures that are damaged. There is lost economic opportunity. That is, the money that we're putting into repair is not being put into other things that it could be. There's disruption of commerce. Again, we were in a panic to get our waterfront put back together for the coming season here. We can't work on these structures all year round. We have to pick our weather windows. So we have to fix them when we can. And our waterfront property in the town right now is valuated at around 220 million. That's properties that are directly on the water. And that includes both commercial and private property. So there's a substantial value of property that's at risk. And there's these estimates on annual revenue, I will say, are pretty crude at this point. But we're getting somewhere in a range of $8 million a year in revenue directly from the waterfront itself. And I think that is probably an underestimate. We've got 75 merchants that are making businesses off the waterfront and the downtown, which is adjacent to it. 100 individual properties, private properties. We have 12 charter sailing vessels that bring in a good deal of business into this town. There are passengers and that come with their families. We have 15 commercial fishing vessels that are listing Camden as their home port. We get over 10,000 tourists a year, and we get over 2,000 jobs in Camden and the surrounding immediate area that are dependent on this waterfront. So it's in our interest to have a plan, to know what the heck we're going to do if things continue to get more difficult, as I think we can expect they will. And this is an example here of the damage that occurred in the last storm. Some of this damage was to municipal properties. The big picture here on the right happened to be a private property, the Morongs Pier down on off of Bayview Street, and the whole pier was broken off of its moorings and had to be lifted and reattached. And I watched this work being done, and I can tell you, the guys that are doing this work are amazing. They are absolutely incredible in how they handle these big structures and repinning the granite and all the things that they have to do to restore it. But in the left here, this is just this shows you see these stone pavers here. They're roughly 3 feet by 2 feet. They weigh probably 150 to 175 pounds each. They were lifted and thrown into the parking lot at Camden Yacht Club. And it's a 2-man lift to put one of those back. Partly why that happens, you need to understand, is that granite, even though it's heavy in water, it loses about 1/3 of its weight because the water makes the granite slightly buoyant. So granite isn't as heavy in water and it moves more easily. And water is extremely dense, and when it's moving, it is extremely powerful. This is the crack in the seawall on the south side of the Camden Yacht Club. And that seawall moved 8 inches as a result of the backwash and the pressure that built up behind it from being inundated. So the waves came over the top. It filled the area behind the breakwater like a bathtub. And then as the storm receded and it moved away, all of that water pressure bore against the back of that wall, and the water flowed out through it. But a lot of that damage was done by the impact of waves, and wave velocity increases with wave length. And so these 600-foot wavelengths that we saw, the waves were moving at approximately 30 knots. And so that's, I don't know if you've ever fallen out of a boat skiing, but if you did at 30 knots, you know that water is like concrete. It has a tremendous impact. So that's part of what happened. And this was the repair that was done. And I can't even find out how long ago, but there was concrete poured in front of the seawall at Camden Yacht Club to try to shore it up from the previous damage. And that concrete apron is broken and is pulled away from the seawall, so it's no longer providing support. So these are serious forces, and you know, we the town's claim into FEMA to try to get reimbursement from some of the cost of repairing this damage has been accepted by the administration, but we're a long way from seeing any compensation coming from that. And this kind of damage, you're basically self-insuring. The entire town is self-insured. FEMA is our insurance in terms of municipal property, and private property, unless you pay some considerable exorbitant premiums, is also essentially being privately insured by the cost of replacing these structures. So I can tell you that this has been going on for quite a while. So this is the litany of the costs from the 78 storm, and shows an estimate back then of roughly $750,000. Again, these, who knows how much it actually costs to do the repair, because these estimates get thrown out there and then you find out some months later what it actually cost you. So what do we do about it? The problem is not the water level, it's the waves. And if you take nothing else from this presentation, I would say, remember this, that it is the waves that are causing the damage. And the wave energy is proportionate to the square of the velocity of the wave. And so if that wave is going at 30 knots, you take the square of that, that's the proportionate difference in the energy of the wave. And so, I mean, if you take a wave at 30 and take a wave at 10, you got a ratio of, 100 to 900. So it's 9 times the force with a 3-time increase in velocity. So the waves are the problem. We can withstand flooding a lot easier and a lot less expensively than we can withstand wave action. So what happens also with waves is, as they start to get into shallow water, they actually decrease in speed, but as they do so, they increase in height. And so the mass of water moving is the same, but it's getting higher. And when it starts to break, then it accelerates. And the mass hasn't changed. So it's still very destructive. And what you have to do to reduce that damage is to slow the waves down. And the only way to really effectively do that, I say the only way, but when we're talking about storms of this magnitude, there's a lot of interest in things like floating breakwaters and structures that you can help to mitigate small waves with. But when we're talking about, 7 to 8 foot waves, like was showing you on that cover, these waves are not going to be slowed down by floating structures unless you put massive anchors and weights in to absorb that energy. So what can we actually do? Well, we can try to harden our structures so that they can withstand the pressure from the waves. And that's basically what we're in the process of doing with our town dock, what we'll be doing with the yacht club breakwater or seawall, is we're going to try to build them back and build them stronger and more able to handle these pressures. But the pressures will eventually overcome unless we do other things. And that means elevating structures to get them out of the waves. That's another alternative. And the third alternative, which is maybe the least desirable, but that is to move away from the source of the problem, which is the water itself. For Camden, we need to take concerted action now to come up with a plan, a strategy for how we're going to deal with this in the future. The lead times on doing things of this nature, whether it's raising structures or hardening structures or whatever options you have, they take a long time, and raising money for these things is not a simple matter. And even getting public funds is a very difficult task in and of itself. And I'm going to bring up the subject of a breakwater or breakwaters as a possible solution, because what breakwaters do is they make the waves break further away from the structures that you're trying to protect, and they absorb the energy before it gets to the shore-based structure. So the whole idea is to create turbulence, to break up the waves, to cause them to dissipate that energy before they get to the structures that you're trying to protect. All right, at that point, I've already spoken longer. And maybe I should open it up to some questions, but I do have some more material in here about breakwaters and how they might be used. But these are expensive structures, and I don't want to get too far into it as far as what it would cost. But I should say that we have attempted at least, let's see, I think I've got, yeah, here we go. The history of breakwater initiatives. So 1927 is the first record that I've been able to find in our public records of a concerted effort. And that was when we had something called a Board of Trade in Camden. In 1935, we had a petition that was signed by 34 year-round and 33 seasonal residents of Camden. And 47, we had two storms, one in 44 and 145, that were nearly Category 1 hurricanes that basically destroyed the harbor. There's pictures of Lyman Morris's, it's not Lyman Morris back then, the Camden Shipyard Railway that was destroyed by the first of those storms in 1944. And in 45, we had another one. And so in 47, the town got the Army Corps of Engineers in to discuss two things, which was the dredging of the harbor, but also what we might be able to do for a breakwater back then. And then in 54, we had two hurricanes. These are very notorious events. We had two hurricanes within 9 days in 54. And they occurred one at the end of August and one in early September. And Hurricanes Carol and Edna. And there were still boats in the harbor. And there was over $3.5 million of damage done just to the boats in Camden Harbor from that storm. And so we went after it back then. It wasn't until 66 when Senator Margaret Chase Smith submitted a resolution to Congress to get a study of a breakwater for Camden. Of course, by this time, Rockland and Bar Harbor had already gotten breakwaters built. Camden wasn't seen as a commercial port back then, and so we came in late to the game. The damage in 1967 also caused an invigoration of that effort to get the Army Corps to do something. And it was reported then that we'd had over $10 million of damage spanning 20 years. So we were seeing $500,000 a year of damage to the harbor. And this was in the late 50s and early 60s. But at that time, we had Margaret Chase Smith's support, but out of necessity, we decided we needed a sewer plant. And in 1967, the Camden town did not have a sewer plant, and all the raw sewage was going straight into the harbor, and all of the buildings along the waterfront faced away from the water. And you can see that in the pictures that in the library here. So then in 1980, well, nothing came out of it because we spent $28 million on a sewage treatment plant. In 1980, the citizens said we needed a plan, and it had for the harbor and needed to include breakwaters, and that the businesses, as I mentioned earlier, in the town were contributing, over $7 million a year to the economy, and therefore it was in our interest to spend some money on getting a breakwater plan. That didn't happen. And the editorials in 1982 in the Camden Herald made this statement: that Camden should secede from the Union, attack Boston, and then surrender and claim relief to get funds. So that was the level of desperation that was being felt by the citizenry at the time. It wasn't until 2017 that we went back to the Army Corps. I'm sorry, we did go back to the Army Corps in 2006 and asked for a study. But it wasn't until 2017 that the Army Corps actually came back with the feasibility study. And that was after several meetings with the town. And at that time, the town elected not to continue on. It was basically not a conscious decision, but a lack of action taken by the town to follow through with the Army Corps and go forward to the next phase, which would have been a detailed design of the breakwaters, and it would have cost Camden roughly, well, in today's dollars, say $250,000, and the Army Corps would have matched that. But if we'd gone through with it, we would have had a plan that we could have executed at that time with funding, and that's always the big challenge. So in 2022, the Army Corps withdrew this study, and that was for a number of reasons. But the main one being that the Army Corps assessed that the cost of the project was escalating because of the cost of material, and particularly the cost of granite. And so it exceeded what was at that time a $10 million cap on funds for projects of this small harbor improvement projects. So we know it's going to cost us more than $10 million if we want to do something that would be reasonably effective. But that money would have to be obtained through some combination of public funds, could include private funds, it could be town, state, and or federal. It's something to consider, and we don't really know how the citizenry as a whole would view something like this, but given our debates over budgets, I'm sure it would not be without controversy. So a lot would depend on how we would go about actually getting the funding to do something like this. I have in here some of the designs, and I'll flip through this quickly and then end. This was a 1959 version. shows, breakwater spanning between Dillingham and Monroe. I'm sorry, Curtis. And then it shows Sherman's Point and off of Curtis Island again, other sections.
That's Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah. These all come from the Army Corps. The Army Corps is intimately familiar with Camden's soundings now. This was the 2012 alternatives that were examined. And these alternatives were in the more recent study that was the basis for the Army Corps feasibility.
Jim, what are the different colored lines, please?
Okay, those are wave height contours. So these outer, this is so this is roughly 2 foot waves. And these are 4 foot waves, 5 foot, and 7 foot. So 7 foot is what we would see coming all the way in the harbor if there was no breakwater.
Where would the both jetties be or seawall be?
Well, these lines here are the locations that were proposed for this option here. And there was one here between Dillingham and Curtis. There were these coming off of Curtis and another one coming off of Sherman's Point, and an exit here and an exit there. So these, none of this ever got as far as getting public review or comment. And so these I include these just so you have some idea what the effect would be on knocking the wave amplitudes down. So those outer contours on these charts, the colored ones, show what would be 2 foot waves instead of something like 7 foot. Sir.
Bill, what would those be made of? Would that be granite block like the pier in in Rockland?
Something like that. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, they call that an armored wall.
Does that, I don't know what the construction of the Rockland breakwater looks like below the water line.
It's sloped about 60 degrees, and it's basically just piled up granite. And then the fit block was set on top of that. So that cut stone, it lays on top of basically broken granite boulders and that came out of the quarries. But
and that breakwater is always there's all the blocks are always being moved around and tipped on their edges, and
no, that breakwater has been extremely stable to my knowledge.
for the years I've seen them when you walk out there.
Yeah, you do see, I mean, there is some discontinuity, but I mean, that breakwater has been there. To my knowledge, nobody's ever moved those stones.
No, just the top one skip. Out of level. You know,
Do you know that they've actually been repaired, or is it just?
that I haven't been out there for a long time.
Well, to my knowledge, that there may be some settling, but I mean, honestly, if you look at that, if you cite that with a transit, that breakwater is unbelievably level. I mean, it is, you can tell by the water when it comes to the top of that breakwater.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see that line, it all disappears at once. It's not sloped and there aren't big gaps in it. So it was extremely well built.
What would be the objective to the elevation that this would be built to?
Well, that's part of the study, because the higher you go, the more it costs, right? And I do, there are charts that the Army Corps provided that showed that you could get benefit from different heights in terms of the amount of wave action that would be reduced. But anything you can do to absorb what happens, you cause the wave to break, and then that dissipates the energy. What happens is turbulence is basically chaotic motion, but what it does is it dissipates energy. So anything you can do to cause the wave to break will dissipate the energy before it gets to the structures that you're trying to protect. So it doesn't have to be high enough to stop the highest wave, dead in its track. You're going to see waves that overtop it. That's what happens in Rockland. I mean, the storm in December overtopped the Rockland breakwater considerably, but the storm surge at the town dock, as an example, or the town landing, was pretty modest. I mean, but I've got, anybody can see video of it online, and there's a foot and a half maybe of wave action. Most of it's short wavelengths being stirred up by the wind just coming across the surface of the harbor, but it's not the swells that are being stopped by the breakwater at the outside of the harbor. So that's the idea, sir.
About 5 years ago, the Watershed School had a public presentation of a project that the students did, which begins to address the previous question about how high you make the breakwater. Given the data they had then, and I think given everything we hear in the news about the accelerated melting and everywhere, that they were talking about 2100, if nothing was done to mitigate our sea level rise, that Camden would be looking at a mean high water levels about 6 feet higher than our current. That everything between Bayview Street and the harbor would be inundated in high water. Who can guess?
Right.
There's enough stuff in the news. It
Yeah.
seems to imply that if we don't do something, we're going to be seeing higher just water levels. Forget storms, and then
Right.
storms just create a problem on top of that.
Yes.
But I'm a member of the Camden Yacht Club. I saw what happened. I was down
Yeah.
there when it was happening, and what are they going to do? They raise the building 3-4 feet, and wait for a sea level rise? I'm just really puzzled at how, if we did something tomorrow, whether it would be adequate.
Well, let me, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Is there a question? No, I understand that, that it seems daunting. The thing I can tell you is if we don't have a plan, nothing's going to happen. And as Charlie Brown said, there's no problem so difficult or complicated that it cannot be solved by inaction. And, Mother Nature will take care of the problem for us. The question is, what do we do to try to preserve, the functioning of our waterfront the way it is? That's going to be the challenge. But as I showed earlier, that the options to raise up versus hardening, build stronger, build taller, or move away. Those are the three basic options, because we're not going to stop whatever's going to happen with the tide level. That's been set in motion by events that are 50, 100 years and behind us, and the outcomes are going to be 50 or 100 years more before we know.
There are places where you actually close the harbor off at high water.
Yes.
With gates.
Yeah. It's probably not a great option for us because we have a river coming down through, but no, I mean, we're going to have, whatever we do is going to have to permit, if we end up doing something in the outer harbor, it's going to have to permit a free flow of water when it's needed to get out of the harbor. I mean, that could affect all kinds of things. So we would want to be very careful about how that was designed. But as an example, I mean, we're talking about a long-term project, and if we so choose, and to give you an example, it took 20 years, and I think it was 1880. Oh, Ken, you know better than I would, but I think it was 1880 something, 1888 or 89, when the Rockland, actually it took them until then to get approval for the construction of the breakwater. 20 years it took them to get approval. And then it took them 28 years to actually build it.
We don't have that.
Not necessarily. But our solution isn't as difficult, and we have a lot less of a harbor to protect in terms of distances. But no, it would take a long-term concerted effort, and we haven't demonstrated the will to do that in this town. You know, every time we get hammered by another storm or several storms, as the case has been, you know, we haven't stuck to it long enough to get it to work, to get it to go. But the real issue is, what's the risk to us economically as we go forward if we don't? We at least need to consider it. We have to consider it carefully, because the options are also expensive.
Do we have data from harbors that are similar to Camden's with the same exposure that have built a breakwater to know? how they-
I'm glad you bring that up. Well, the answer is the Army Corps has data, a lot of data, because they're the ones that build these things all over. Yeah, so these charts like this are based on predictive models that the Army Corps uses. But there's,
I mean, it's not speculative, they really should.
they've been validated. Yeah, the models, but there's a heck of a lot better tools out today than were used to produce these charts. That's 2012. I mean, you know how much technology has advanced since. So I will mention that there is an effort that's being undertaken by a professor at Northeastern University, Julia Hopkins. And I'm working with Julia on a project to put wave measurement buoys outside of Camden Harbor, so that we can, she has the mathematical models, numerical models that do the kind of finer computer simulations of the waves and currents, and with much higher resolution and fidelity. And that would allow us to do many different studies to see what the effect might be. So I'm hopeful that we're going to have those buoys in outside of Camden Harbor.
We know that the breakwater in Rockland is effective, but it's a different exposure.
It is, and that's why you see that breakwater was only built from the south, from the north side, extending south, because the exposure that they were concerned with coming from the south would have entered the north part of the harbor. They were pretty well protected by Owl's Head, but for them the exposure was greater from that angle. So the original plan was to build that breakwater from both shores, and after 28 years they said enough.
Is Rockport's exposure similar to Camden's?
Yes and no. They're actually the contour, the contours of the coastline south of Rockport extend more to the east. So the angles at which they see surge coming in there, the wave action coming in there, are actually disrupted by the coastal contours.
Probably might be able to collaborate.
Yeah. It's always a likelihood. Go ahead, Josh.
There are more recent drawings of a breakwater proposal that don't show a wall between Dillingham Point and Curtis Island. Do you have those?
This might be one of them. Yeah, I'm sorry. This was the 2016. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of there was a lot of discussion about this proposal and about whether or not opening up the channel, the Northeast Channel this way, was going to be an acceptable approach or not. But you know, again, we never got very far in terms of considering it.
But we don't really know, because we don't have the wave data.
The predictive data, yeah. That's frankly why I showed those earlier depictions, because they did attempt to get some wave contours. It was a fairly crude estimate.
But the yellow lines you showed us on the previous slide, I mean, to a yachtsman, that looks like Camden Harbor is just closed off to the sea.
Yeah, I mean, I could understand that perspective. I mean, there are actually two openings here and here. But compared to having that unobstructed, completely unobstructed, that's a big difference. But recognize that this area right here is already obstructed by ledges. And the Sherman's Point, this doesn't extend all that far out, but because the water gets quite deep in here, but yeah, that's how this one is gone. You know, I don't vouch for any of these. I'm just saying that this is stuff that came up, and it came up and it was examined at the time.
And there are ports in the world that have such, where you can only enter.
Oh, yeah.
Like Judith, or something, are there places near here that you can go see?
Marblehead. I mean, you know, actually, I think Gloucester is probably the closest to what we have. Josh?
I just, on that 2016 alternative you showed there, I just wanted to find out a little more about the sort of natural breakwater. It seems like the ledges you were saying at low tide basically form a breakwater.
They are
So essentially what you'd be doing is just elevating it, just making it.
reinforcing it, yeah.
At high tide, you still have that northeast channel, it would be a rerouted northeast channel.
Exactly.
But between Dillingham Point and Curtis Island, that is exposed, but it's pretty shallow in there, right?
It is. These are low water soundings here, but again, that could have come off Curtis as well. It didn't have to come off, you know, Dillingham. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways to play with
Sort
this.
of, we have a certain amount of natural protection, we just sort of accentuating.
Enhance it.
enhancing.
Yeah, I think that's the smart way to do it. Try to avoid the amount of construction that you're involved with.
Jim, does that show a little spur of red coming out the south end or southeast end of Curtis Island?
No, that's the light symbol.
That's the light. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what we're heading for here is to be able to have a computer model that we can then play what if games with. And that's what Northeastern is going to help produce. And we're going to get these wave buoys in the water here in June. And then it will be some time, perhaps a year, before we see the results, because they have to acquire the data and then calibrate the model. That's not quite the correct term, but validate the model so that we can see whether the model is accurately predicting the wave effects or not.
How many months or years does those buoys need to be collecting data in order to get a statistically accurate picture?
In talking with Julie about it, we were thinking that we've put in a request for the permit that we've requested is for a full year. I think anything we can get, even 4 months would be useful, but if we can keep it going for a full year, that will be extremely valuable. The buoys have to be watched over and periodically cleaned because they can get fouled. But the idea is also to keep an eye on them during the winter. And any guys with boats in the water that want a job.
Where will those buoys be?
We're still actually, we're expecting to get that sorted out fairly soon, but at least one of them is going to be out here to the east of the ledges, and we want it far enough out so that we don't get the reflection off the ledges. And then the other one could actually be in here, somewhere between, but inside of those channel marks, or it could be out here. So I'm still working, well, Julia is still debating where she thinks they need to be, and we're probably gonna do a little bit of on the water survey before we determine exactly where they're gonna be. And they do look like frisbees, big frisbees. So if you see something out there that looks like a floating frisbee, that's about that big around.
Jim, can you just maybe if you had a slide like that one that you have that would show the actual angle of that storm in December as it came through there?
Yeah, honestly, let me go back here.
You could do it with a yardstick, I guess.
Oh, yeah, well, I can tell you it. You know, southeast, this is roughly north-south direction, so it came right in through here. I mean, it slammed in here between Curtis and Dillingham, and it swept in through the, between the ledges and Curtis. But that direction, this was the direction. Right here. And we were seeing 50 knots of wind in that direction, and then later on in the afternoon, it actually clocked around more to the south, and we actually got 60 knots, 65 knots on the instruments at Lyman Morris. So that what was happening is, you know, the winds are getting funneled into this harbor. I mean, anybody who's been on the water here for a while knows that effect. That, you know, when the winds come from the south, we can get, and the other thing that happens when they come from the northwest, you know, we get big eddies coming around those mountains, and we get these big vortices, and they come sweeping down. And if you're out a little bit, you can be sitting in here in calm air, and you can go a quarter of a mile further out, and you can be in 30 knots of wind. And it's just from the, you know, the effects of the terrain and the elevation.
Did you have a working committee or are you a committee of one?
No, I'm not a committee of one. Not much as I'd like to. No, I mean, Josh is here, Josh Moore, he's our committee. No, I'm feeding all my information to Josh, and the idea is that the Harbor Committee will be the forum for, you know, this kind of investigation discussion.
So there is a body that exists.
Oh, yeah,
To do
yeah,
that. Sorry.
that's
I'm
Josh.
down, I don't know.
That's Josh Moore, sitting right behind you. All right.
A question on Zoom. David Kibbe, I don't know if you know
Yes.
him. He says, Jim, great presentation. As a citizen of Camden, I think we owe you a debt for your service in bringing the science and evidence to bear on our future welfare. What, in your opinion, are the 3 highest priority actions we need to take to protect our harbor and our town?
That's a good question. I mean, one thing that we are doing is, and I think is a high priority, is to try to get better data, better science on what are we experiencing and what are the effects if we try to change something. You know, how would it affect the dynamics of the harbor? So that computer modeling that's been initiated is extremely important. But the other thing I think is equally important is starting to plan and figure out a strategy, which will probably have more than one option or several options for how we might deal with the future. And because these are extremely long-term projects, regardless of how we approach it, with or without breakwater, you know, raising the town is not a minor activity. And so, you know, at least getting these things on the table and looking at what the possible costs and benefits of these options would be, I think is very important. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.